So welcome everybody. It's an honor for me to speak here, and I invite you to join my experiences and my accompanying of people, which is the main source of what I will present today. Trauma and abuse is a big subject, and yes, you can be redeemed from a trauma, though it is one of the most serious damages to the soul. The soul seems to die, at least that is what it feels like. Each form of persisting or violent abuse is traumatizing, as it destroys the victim's dignity. In the first step, I will explain the dimensions of abuse. The second step is to explain what a trauma is and how it affects a person. The third step will show two possibilities of how to be redeemed from trauma by therapy and by grace. From a theological viewpoint, we can finally find reconciliation in God. The dimensions of abuse. Abuse is a kind of violation of the human dignity. It causes a profound debasement of one's dignity. This leads to the death of the soul. In what follows, I will apply a general model of the existential dimensions that persons are living. I will present the main values which have to be warranted in order to safeguard a person's dignity. Abuse severely challenges these dimensions and values. Human beings live in 5 main relationships. In relationship to their own person, to other persons, to the non-personal world, the surrounding reality, and to a comprehensive meaning which theologians regard as seen in the relationship to God, as well as to the truth and values, the inner part of the tetrahedron model you see, given by and in these balanced relationships. The dignity of the person, of the human being, can be characterized by the 4 main values: life, freedom, love, and truth. You find these central values in the tetrahedron model linked to the 4 corners and the consonant of the tetrahedron. Each value is linked to the subject governing it. Individuals control their essential freedom. Nobody else may do that. The others control their love, not me. Nobody else may force them to love. The control of truth would mean to control reality, which is not possible. Treating life as if we're under control would destroy each possibility of meaning. These basic values constitute dignity, and we are responsible to warrant this. Dignity constitutes the deepest value a person can feel. If someone neglects one or more of the 4 basic values, dignity is threatened and trauma subsequently follows. Each form of wrong love or the deprivation of love can cause a traumatic wound, especially in the first years of life when a child is totally dependent on his or her parents or on parental persons. A lack of freedom can cause one of the dominant feelings of trauma, powerlessness. Arbitrariness replacing truth is the strongest impediment to freedom, as freedom is only possible in a safe and steady environment. Oh, it's too quick. Going forward. Excuse me. Technical problem. Yeah, the next should appear. Yeah, very nice. Life-threatening incidents menace our body, which is the basis for what we are and do. But also losing meaning can destroy life. The soul dies. The experience of a lack of dignity or a broken dignity can be an indicator of trauma. Therefore, safeguarding and restoring dignity is the main aim of therapy in the context of trauma. The who and how of abusing a person. Abuse seriously threatens the above-named basic values and thus dignity. Abuse means taking something away from a person that the person does not want to or cannot give. A claim is laid on one's freedom, and this touches dignity. Betraying or lying and claiming the trust of others is a form of abuse. Claiming someone's love means abusing it. Governing someone's inward and outward life can also be described as abuse. These four aspects of abuse can be found in each kind of abuse we will deal with. In the context of sexual abuse, only the body seems to be attacked. But to be clear, the soul is also abused, as the body is intrinsically tied to the person as such, to the soul, to the innermost self. Kinds of abuse. We can discern abuse according to the aim and to the method of procedure. By sexual abuse, the victim's body is used to stimulate another person's body. Psychological abuse profits by the emotions, by the loyalty of another person. The person is emotionally coerced into a situation not freely chosen. Spiritual abuse attacks another person. It destroys the transcendence, the victim's possibility to experience meaning, as power is claimed in the name of God. The methods are the following. Sexual rape violates bodily and psychological integrity. By this, it rapes freedom. Freedom can be regained through a loving and meaningful relationship. Psychological rape touches two other central values and attacks spirit and emotions. Truth and love are lost. Indeed, it is difficult to regain trust in honesty and relationship. However, the refuge of a higher meaning, religion, stays possible. At least someone is trustworthy. Spiritual rape questions the last resort, meaning and God himself. If you are raped in the name of God, where can you flee to? No resort is left. That means the more dimensions that are involved, the deeper a person is affected by rape, the more dignity is destroyed. Abusing a relationship is another kind of abusing power, as there are two sources of power: structure, law for example, or relationship. In a relationship, openness makes the person vulnerable. Trust is easily violated, integrity is lost. The closer you are to a person, the greater the danger is of permanent invisible border crossing, as victims are emotionally bound to the person tending to abuse them. In church, an essential alliance between structure and relationship exists due to the personal vocation to live in relationship to God and to each other. The position of power is intertwined with the position of trust. Even more, God's authority can be abused for spiritual torture. In the name of God, sex, health, money, but also trust and belief are claimed. Victims lose their last resort. Therefore, abuse in the church totally destroys dignity. Second chapter, Dimensions of Trauma. I start with some definitions. Large decisive events, possibly also combined with total destruction, are called traumatic. However, small but unavoidable destructive events can also lead to someone being traumatized. The constant threat of latent and subliminal violence in one's own home, arbitrariness, humiliation, withdrawal of affection and lies, simply the 100,000 pinpricks of everyday life can be just as deadly as a major traumatic event. I call those experiences that completely destroy the ability to trust life traumatic. In a traumatic experience, the person concerned has the feeling of absolute powerlessness, of existential loss, of being destroyed. Trauma, therefore, is a life-threatening psychological injury. Through the trauma, the soul dies. As a result of the trauma, something unforgettable is learned. Even if the experience is repressed, it is not forgotten. The trauma can be compared to an emergency shutdown of the soul. It is an absolute experience that is very difficult to share. This leads to the feeling of being totally abandoned. A traumatic experience marks the soul indelibly. It remains in the soul even if and precisely when a person is quite unable to remember this event. Unfortunately, by trauma we learn something that is very counterproductive, namely, I can do nothing, I am helpless, I am completely and utterly at someone's mercy. I have to die. This lesson is constantly re-invoked when victims are stressed. They lose control and end up in the grip of powerlessness. An anthropological dimension is seen in the emergency breakdown, shutdown of the soul. I just want to explain this fundamental mechanism. When someone finds him or herself in a situation that is emotionally threatening, the soul saves itself by activating a protective mechanism. It switches off the feelings. Nevertheless, the soul is not dead. It experiences what happens now. It is present, but it is encapsulated. As a result, the person no longer has access to it. Sometimes it is evoked by so-called triggers. The victim falls back into the feelings of trauma. Unfortunately, the trauma continues to have an effect. The emergency shutdown of the soul creates something absolute, a deep nothingness, a psychological hole. The self is shut down, it shatters. Consequently, traumatized persons lose their freedom, and that loss is absolute. They often also lose relationship, love, as many traumas occur at the moment when a person is alone with the perpetrator or a relationship is perverted. Victims mostly cannot give expression to their terrible feelings, and no one believes them. Their truth seems unbelievable. They lose trust and feel hopelessly abandoned. Meaning is destroyed. These aspects of trauma all met the central aspects of abuse. For this reason, abuse is traumatizing. Thus, trauma and abuse destroy the innermost part of the human person and as a whole. This is because what offends against the dignity of a person and is at the same time unavoidable or inescapable causes trauma. This is what happens in abuse. Though trauma seems to shut down thinking and feeling, it follows a certain logic. We can see a certain succession in the emergence of the trauma. When it arises, the first feeling is anger. Frustration and anger are biologically meaningful. They help us to approach something, to oppose something, and to change something. If we do not manage to do this, panic arises. Fear is evoked. If panic and terror continue for a length of time, powerlessness sets in. The profound, unfathomable powerlessness is often accompanied by an equally deep and unfathomable grief. These feelings evoke the unavoidable experience that the soul is going to die. Powerless and abandoned, no longer the master of their own life, victims feel displaced and wrong. They feel, if I am wrong, then nobody is able to help me. It now seems as though the trauma has become entrenched. Nevertheless, an escape is possible if victims accept help that leads them out of powerlessness through grief and anger to inner freedom. The consequences of trauma sometimes look like mental illness, but victims react in a completely healthy and normal way to a totally abnormal and unhealthy situation, no more than that. They can use this underlying health to escape from the trauma. Trauma is thus a normal reaction to an abnormal situation. It makes a person collapse. This has consequences for the body. The body has a memory. It stores what happens. Mortal fear may result in attempted suicide or fantasies of suicide. Many traumatized individuals attack their own bodies. It is not perceived or taken seriously and is neglected. Victims lose the ability to cry and the possibility to experience closeness and distance innocently. These feelings become ambivalent. I want closeness and I need distance. Trauma has consequences to the relationships with reality. When the body is split off and the soul switched off, fundamental realities are lost. Victims are often unable to appreciate bare facts as well as themselves correctly. Their will does not function properly, it is blocked. They just somehow function and may all of a sudden slide into the abyss of the traumatic feelings without being able to stop it. They are tortured by nightmares and wake up bathed in sweat or crying out. Flashbacks, moments of relived panic, confront them with their original fears. The trauma remains their reality. Trauma has consequences for relationships. Someone has penetrated the self, the innermost center of another person. The consequence is that the outsider now governs within that person and determines what happens. Victims must take over the perpetrator's wishes, their thinking process, their feelings, and therefore start feeling wrong. Some victims feel as if living in the shape of the perpetrator's body. They lose the concept of their own body. When social relationships shatter, the victims of trauma are simply afraid to trust others again. They end up in isolation. The consequences for the relationship to one's own selves are severe. Self-alienation and super-alienation, which means alienation by others, follow from the trauma. When the soul is traumatized, we can notice a phenomenon that is often overlooked. Namely, the development of the soul comes to a halt at the moment the trauma took place. The adult stays inwardly a fearful and lost child. Moreover, the emotions connected with trauma do not disappear in time, but rather have the tendency to become stronger and to spread. They are felt with a certain delay, and they can flood everything else. As no actual trigger can be found, self-doubt can rise, accompanied by self-destructive thoughts, blockages, self-condemnation, self-punishment, and self-demolition. Self-accusation has a deeper meaning, as victims can tell themselves, if I am personally guilty, this traumatizing behavior will stop if I put it right. This enables the victim to uphold the illusion that they have control of the situation because it is better to be guilty than powerless. Nevertheless, this has consequences for the relationship to meaning. Trauma threatens and destroys life, inner life. Victims have the experience that they are no longer valuable, that they are worthless, guilty, destroyed, disgusting. This is how meaning and dignity are destroyed. The way out requires courage. The courage to accept help, to face the abyss, to start again, and to face the inner hell. Victims cannot do this alone. They need professional company. They should, however, take the decision to leave this hell by themselves, it is dangerous to expect others in the trauma context to change. This may end up in disappointment. Victims can reassess the traumatizing influence and see it is over. Spirituality can be affected by trauma. Trauma, by definition, is an event so discrepant from a person's meaning system that it alters or damages that person's meaning system, state, slattery, and path, because it causes discrepancy among belief, values, goals, and perceptions of events. Faith might be seen as a protective factor, but often the survivors experience imbalance. Trauma may interrupt one's beliefs. One's perception of God can be damaged by trauma, can themselves cause trauma or finally be healed. It causes a spiritual crisis. And touches the metaphysical worldview of the view of God, especially if it occurs in the name of God or is carried out by religious. It makes sometimes steps it should not yet make. Excuse me. Go back. Yeah. Especially if it occurs in the name of God or is carried out by religious leaders or religious beliefs. Moreover, victims are disappointed. Are disappointed if their church does not provide adequate help. Spirituality is affected by existential anxiety and doubts caused by trauma. God is, in a certain manner, losing his identity and his apparent existence. Questions such as, what was God thinking, or why did God let this happen, may arise. Through a traumatizing experience, especially in the trauma in a relationship, a person can feel separated from spirituality. In trauma, God seems to lose his power and the image of God is perverted. Victims feel guilt and shame. They think that God blames and condemns them. As victims experience untrustworthy persons, they cannot trust in God as a person anymore. The extreme loneliness, forsakenness, and abandonment the victims experience resemble Jesus' situation on Holy Saturday, when his divine presence is marked by absence. Between the Passion and the Resurrection, there's no life, no light, and no words. But simultaneously, he incarnates the promise of redemption. As he suffered through the entirety of possible suffering, he was with the victim when it happened. He is risen from death. As he is risen from death, all victims will rise from all form of death by him. Redemption, or how to restore dignity. We learned about the succession of feelings appearing in trauma and their inherent logic. Thus, the very first step is to accept help. This seems to be easy, but this is precisely the most difficult step for someone who has been abused and traumatized in a relationship. Accepting help means trusting another person absolutely. It is difficult, but also the only way out of the trauma is now the victim is not alone anymore. In the relationship to a person providing help, former victims may experience that they are right, may feel dignified, perhaps for the first time. This is how the soul returns to life and is empowered for taking the next steps. panic decreases and security grows, and a healthy anger says no. Former victims become able to protect themselves from former or further traumatizing influences. The following 4 steps to redemption can only be done if one condition is fulfilled, namely accepting help. Trusting yourself is based on the trust in the trustworthy other. The 4 steps will be further developed throughout the course following the next days. The first step deals with guilt. The first step is to forgive yourself. Feelings of shame and guilt, oops, it goes on again automatically. Don't know why that does so. Okay, the first step is to forgive yourself. Feelings of shame and guilt undermine the victim's relation to themselves and thus undercut free decisions. Victims must give up their false feelings of guilt and accept that they are victims indeed, but also capable to changing their position. The second step is accepting suffering. The second step clarifies the actual situation. Realization sinks into the victim. A real crime has been done to me. The person who did this to me is a perpetrator. I must accuse him. As soon as victims accept this fact, their relation to the truth is repaired. The third step is accepting redemption. This step helps to restore meaning in the victim's life and to regain life as such. The psychological healing will be finalized as redemption by God Himself. Nobody can give back to the victim what he/she lost: life, dignity, new perspectives. God can do that, and we help Him in doing so. This will give rise to hope and finally to inner peace. The fourth step is the final one, it's forgiving. The last step only takes place after redemption. Only now the time has come to forgive, which means to let go the perpetrator's guilt. This is an important step for regaining freedom and leaving the role of victim. It seems a paradox, but this step is important to recuperate the relation to others in general. If one is guilty, the others are not. Even the relationship to the perpetrator becomes new. He is freed from guilt. Though forgiving is not yet reconciliation. This would presume that the perpetrator has offered a serious apology. If he cannot or does not, the victim must let him go. The aim is restored dignity. The experience of dignity is innately meaningful. The experience of redemption is innately healing. Also, in the relationship to truth and meaning, we find confusion and destruction in the context of trauma. What is holy becomes trivial, namely dignity. What is trivial becomes holy, for example, in compulsive behavior or addiction. In order to restore dignity, the patient needs real devotion. Methodological devotion is not sufficient to replace the lack of love. In order to regain freedom, victims learn to defend themselves against life-threatening influences and take a lot of small steps back to autonomy. It is a deep acknowledgement of truth if victims are finally able to express their anger for the harm done to them. It is the first no against the traumatizing influence, a way back to life of the self which was killed by the trauma. Feelings of guilt, which tend to undermine the experience of dignity, can be given up. but by unconditional love, which means confirming of identity, appreciating individuality, and warranting trustworthiness, the bonding capacity will be restored as emotional resonance. Something like it, yeah. A capacity for empathy will grow and help the survivors to regain the right of dignity. In spirituality, survivors of trauma can find their courage, regain hope, and become whole again. Spiritual redemption is a process. It is the act of taking back something that was wrongly taken from the victim. Spiritual care is in this regard emotional care. Spirituality may not be seen as a specified action to deal with broken meaning and searching for meaning. However, religious and existential well-being abound together. A spiritual relationship to God can help to rediscover the wellspring in the soul. When a former victim encounters this for the first time, it feels like almost inexhaustible riches, like profound peace. Everything is a gift, an overflowing, unending, and awe-inspiring gift. This is the concrete redemption I sometimes saw in accompanying. But we also have to deal with the redemption of the perpetrator. The first and most important item is to accept the perpetrator's dignity. This seems paradox, but it is, as St. Augustine says, accept the sinner, not the sin. This respect for the person as such opens the door to a confrontation with the truth that he is the perpetrator, an appeal to empathy, that he becomes capable of feeling the pain he has caused. Taking over responsibility, which is the first step to a liberating reconciliation with himself and his victim. And finally, restoring meaning. The perpetrator will finally understand that he destroyed his own life and his victim's life. It is hard to see, but these steps are important for making the perpetrator take over responsibility. This restores his own experience of his dignity. I am responsible. I am capable of feeling remorse, and that means that I can love and live a meaningful life. One aspect is that we should be merciful on the person's behalf. Most perpetrators were previously also victims, but to be clear, their own trauma is a challenge, not an excuse, which is true for all trauma. Oh, that's already going too far. I don't know what it does. It sometimes has its own will. Not traumatized, it has still a will. Let's see. So merciful in practice, but still responsible. The other aspect, perpetrators have the right to be seen in their shortfalls, though they must be open to accepting responsibility in order to never again hurt others. The other aspect is that we must stay clear in principles. The truth stays the truth. A crime stays a crime. It is especially important that the message of the Church stays clear, never again. The perpetrator must never return to pastoral work, if you ask me, even after therapy. This clear public sign is crucial. Full reconciliation needs the relationship with God. Without grace, trauma might indeed be insurmountable. On the other hand, religion must not be used as a technical instrument for healing. Salvation, however, is the resource that the human being cannot give to himself. It promises abundance of life and reconciliation. So, providing spiritual help, the healing work of theology and faith communities must not be underestimated. It's funny, it's something that's really what you want. They provide place for the traumatic experience, witness of the testimony, and are already well aware of reframing and healing stories. Value and dignity experienced in the community can reconstitute meaning, because most trauma involves an assault on the victim's spirit, identity, and self-worth. Healing from trauma is fundamentally a spiritual process or a quest for spirituality involving a deep need for meaning and value, states Courtwells. It even has an eschatological perspective. Reconciliation is a religious resource. First and foremost, it is reconciliation that is needed with the adverse or cruel fate of trauma and abuse in order to gain the first grace of redemption, the abundance of life. The promise is not just an eschatological one, but rather begins when God's grace touches the broken life in such a way that the chapter of traumatic experience can be closed and a new life can start. Nevertheless, if in some cases reconciliation with the offender remains one-sided, it is only possible in God. Moreover, justice, often not guaranteed by law, is finally left to God, as a reconciliatory justice has different dimensions. It must be put into effect interpersonally, intrapsychically, and metaphysically. Oh, I don't know what it does. Go back. Okay, again, this one. Excuse me, I don't know what it does. It's just... Oops. The latter needs a redemption which cannot be provided by man. No compensation can settle the situation totally, as the wounds never heal totally. A scar will ever remain and hinder life. The full life is only warranted by God and finally through His eternal gift. The religious resource operates via a human actor and mainly by a positive attitude that is characterized by hope, trust, and authentic acceptance. Hope implies the trust of the therapist or of others in supporting the formerly traumatized person to find resources for healing. This hope is stimulated by a positive image of the human person, one that is motivated and guaranteed by faith. This trust leads to the divine promise of healing. The human being searches to escape his/her identity as a victim by hoping that the inner personality can heal. This is the first step to inner freedom. The other attitude is trust. Trusting in the client is crucial for healing a trauma that is caused by abusive relationships. A trustworthy therapist can help the client to regain the trust that he/she lost as a result of a previous trauma. The trust of the patient is necessary in order to surpass the trauma. This trust can even discharge in belief. God seems trustworthy again. It is true. Finally, religious resources must be an authentic part of the therapist's personality. To restore the client's humanity, the therapist must represent a fully loving humanity. His love is the bridge back to new affectionate relationships and even to trusting in God's love. The triple promise must be given by a whole personality of the therapist, a promise fully rooted in the divine promise and warranted by His grace in both the therapist and the victim. In God's eyes, both are precious, dignified by His love. I conclude. It takes a long road consisting of millions of small steps to overcome the traumatic powerlessness caused by abuse. We are responsible to deal with it in a powerfully and loving way. But it must be noted, power can also be abused by not using it. If ever we are able to protect a person in danger of abuse, we are obliged to do so immediately. Do not abandon anybody. Believe each signal and help the person. But do it in wisdom, stimulated by love, whilst respecting both the presumed victim and the presumed perpetrator. Overreaction does not provide the help that is required and may make the situation more severe, even providing a false excuse for the perpetrator. After all, a dignified relationship can best protect the possible victims. Persons who experience dignity will be able to detect a possible perpetrator and stay at a distance. They are empowered to name the problem when necessary, as they know when the lines have been crossed. Victims who have already healed often have developed this capacity. They know now what real love is about. Although they have lost much, they may see in the end that they gained much. A full life, God's gift, worth being lived, loved, and shared. Thank you very much.